Orson Welles, fear of being touched. For a man who commanded attention with his booming voice and cinematic genius, Orson Welles carried a deeply personal and isolating fear, happophobia, the fear of touch. This wasn't just a preference for personal space. It was an aversion so strong that he instinctively recoiled from physical contact. Whether it was a handshake, a pat on the back, or even a simple gesture of affection, Welles kept a noticeable distance. Some believed this fear stemmed from childhood trauma, though he rarely spoke about it. It extended beyond his personal life. His film sets were structured to accommodate his discomfort, often relying on blocking techniques that kept him physically separated from co-stars. His relationships, both personal and professional, were marked by an invisible wall that kept people at arm's length. Even in intimate moments on screen, he found ways to convey passion without close contact, using camera angles and lighting to maintain emotional depth. This fear didn't diminish his presence. If anything, it added to the mystique of a man whose genius was as untouchable as he was. Fred Astaire, fear of elevators. Grace, poise, and seemingly effortless movement defined Fred Astaire on screen. Yet few knew that the man who danced his way into Hollywood history was gripped by an overwhelming fear of elevators. This wasn't just a minor discomfort. It was a deep-rooted phobia that shaped his daily life. No matter how high the building, he would take the stairs, sometimes exhausting himself before performances. His fear wasn't entirely irrational. Elevators were still considered unreliable in his early years, and stories of mechanical failures only fueled his anxiety. Even as technology improved, his phobia never eased. Film studios had to accommodate his needs, ensuring stair access at every location. Travel arrangements were meticulously planned to avoid situations where an elevator was unavoidable. Some speculated that his fear was tied to his need for control. On stage, he dictated every movement, but in an elevator, he was at the mercy of machinery. This aversion wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a constant reminder that even Hollywood's most elegant star had an obstacle he couldn't dance his way out of. Vivien Leigh, fear of public spaces. For all the power and magnetism Vivien Leigh displayed on screen, stepping into a crowded public space was enough to paralyze her. She suffered from agoraphobia, a deep-seated fear of open and crowded places that made everyday outings an ordeal. Large gatherings, bustling streets, and award ceremonies triggered intense anxiety, forcing her to retreat from public life whenever possible. This fear wasn't just a passing discomfort. It dictated where she went, whom she saw, and even which roles she chose. It became especially debilitating later in her career, compounding the effects of her struggle with bipolar disorder. Directors often had to work around her anxiety, ensuring that filming locations were controlled and quiet. Theaters, which should have been her sanctuary, became overwhelming spaces filled with faceless crowds. Even at the height of her success, she often left events early, unable to endure the crushing weight of so many eyes on her. Despite her ability to command the screen with unwavering confidence, in real life, the world outside the set felt vast, unpredictable, and terrifying. Peter Sellers, fear of being alone. The man who could transform into any character, any voice, and any persona had one fear that never left him: solitude. Peter Sellers had an overwhelming dread of being alone, a fear so intense that he filled his life with constant noise and company. Whether on set or at home, he made sure people were always around. Silence was unbearable. He needed conversations, background chatter, even strangers just to keep his mind from spiraling. This fear shaped his relationships. He married 4 times, seeking companionship but often struggling to maintain it. Acting became more than a career. It was an escape. Each role allowed him to disappear into someone else's life, avoiding the quiet moments where he had to confront himself. His need for constant social interaction sometimes led to impulsive decisions, lavish spending on entourages, and an inability to find peace. Even at the height of his fame, with the world at his feet, he was still running. From the silence, from the loneliness, from himself. Bela Lugosi, fear of being buried alive. The man who was popular for coming out alive from a coffin was actually afraid of being buried alive. Bela Lugosi's fear of premature burial wasn't just an odd quirk, it was an obsession that haunted him throughout his life. Taphophobia, the irrational fear of being mistakenly declared dead, was not uncommon in his era, especially in his homeland of Hungary, where folktales of the undead and mistaken burials were widespread. Lugosi reportedly took extreme precautions, sometimes checking his own pulse in moments of anxiety just to confirm he was still alive. Some claim he even kept a bell or mirror nearby as reassurance. His fixation with this fear bled into his work. He was rumored to have slept in a coffin during Dracula's filming, not as a publicity stunt, but as a way to confront his paranoia. Even in death, his phobia remained part of his legacy. Lugosi was famously buried in his Dracula cape, a decision that many saw as a symbolic nod to the role that defined him. But perhaps, in his mind, it was one last attempt to ensure he wouldn't be forgotten underground. Jean Harlow, fear of electricity. Hollywood's original blonde bombshell had a hidden fear that few knew about. Jean Harlow was terrified of electricity. This wasn't just an aversion to shocks or static, it was a full-blown phobia that dictated her daily life. She avoided turning on lights, touching exposed wires, or even staying in rooms with faulty wiring. The fear stemmed from a childhood trauma. Her father had warned her of the dangers of electrocution, and that fear never left her. On set, crew members took extra precautions, ensuring no loose wires or sparking bulbs were in her sight. Friends recalled how she would refuse to use certain appliances, relying on others to handle anything electrical. Some believe this phobia contributed to the delays in her medical treatment. When she fell ill in her final years, early interventions involving electrical medical equipment may have been avoided due to her anxiety. Whether this fear was rational or not, it followed her to the very end, a shadow behind the dazzling lights of Hollywood's golden age. Marlon Brando, fear of germs. Marlon Brando, known for his raw, unfiltered performances, had one thing he could never fully control: his overwhelming fear of germs. This wasn't just a preference for cleanliness, it was an intense paranoia that dictated his interactions with people, his living spaces, and even his career choices. He despised shaking hands and often wiped his palms immediately after unavoidable contact. Guests at his home were sometimes required to wash their hands multiple times, and he was known to disinfect surfaces obsessively. On set, this fear created challenges. He would sometimes refuse close contact scenes or insist on personal precautions that slowed production. As he aged, the phobia intensified, contributing to his reclusive lifestyle. His homes were often described as isolated fortresses designed to keep contamination at bay. Some speculate that his aversion to the outside world was as much about germs as it was about people. Brando's larger-than-life presence on screen masked the deep anxieties that made his off-screen world much smaller, a place where control over cleanliness provided the only sense of security. Greta Garbo, fear of crowds. Greta Garbo, the star who defined Hollywood's golden age, spent most of her life running from the very thing that made her famous: people. Her fear of crowds wasn't just an artistic preference for solitude, it was an intense anxiety that dictated her every move. At the peak of her career, she avoided premieres, skipped award ceremonies, and rarely gave interviews. Even walking the streets of Hollywood was an ordeal. She would disguise herself, change her routes, and find ways to avoid public encounters. This fear extended to her work. She insisted on filming scenes with as few people on set as possible, creating an intimacy that became her trademark. But even acting couldn't keep her in the spotlight for long. By the 1940s, she vanished entirely, retreating to a secluded apartment in New York where she lived for decades, carefully avoiding the outside world. It wasn't just a desire for privacy, it was an escape from a fear that had shaped her entire life. Her legacy as Hollywood's most mysterious star wasn't just about choice, it was about survival. Katharine Hepburn, fear of public speaking. For someone who commanded the screen with an unmistakable voice and presence, Katharine Hepburn harbored a crippling fear of public speaking. This wasn't just stage fright. It was an anxiety so deep that she avoided public appearances whenever possible. Award ceremonies, press events, even simple interviews, all were sources of dread. Even in private, speaking to large groups made her uneasy. Some say her fear stemmed from an intense need for control. On a film set, she could rehearse, refine, and perfect every line, but on stage or in front of an audience, there was no safety net. She would often rehearse obsessively, not out of vanity, but because the idea of stumbling over her words in front of others was unbearable. Despite winning multiple Academy Awards, she famously skipped the ceremonies, preferring to let her work speak for itself. While her confidence on screen was legendary, behind the camera, she spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight when it wasn't scripted. Clark Gable, fear of flying. Hollywood's ultimate leading man, Clark Gable, was the picture of confidence on screen, yet the thought of stepping onto a plane filled him with terror. His fear of flying wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a phobia that shaped his career and personal life. He preferred long, grueling cross-country train journeys rather than endure a few hours in the air. The root of this fear can be traced back to his wartime experience. As a member of the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II, he flew in several missions, one of which nearly ended in disaster. Though he survived, the trauma left him with an unshakable fear of aviation. After the war, he refused roles that required extensive air travel, limiting his career in an era when international shoots were becoming more common. Even in his later years, he avoided commercial flights whenever possible. For a man who played fearless heroes, this hidden vulnerability was one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. Joan Crawford, fear of uncleanliness. Joan Crawford's fear of uncleanliness went far beyond a preference for tidiness. It was an all-consuming obsession that dictated every aspect of her life. She washed her hands compulsively, sometimes scrubbing them raw. Visitors to her home were often required to wash theirs upon arrival. Her fear of germs extended to the people around her. Staff members were expected to maintain near-impossible hygiene standards, and even co-stars were subjected to scrutiny. On film sets, she often brought her own dishes, refusing to eat from anything that hadn't been sanitized to her satisfaction. She avoided shaking hands whenever possible, preferring a polite nod instead. Some believe this obsession was rooted in her difficult upbringing, where poverty and instability made control over her environment impossible. In Hollywood, she found success, but cleanliness became a way to exert control over a world that had once been chaotic. Her meticulousness contributed to her reputation as a perfectionist, but beneath it lay an unshakable fear of contamination, one that she could never quite wash away. Alfred Hitchcock, fear of eggs. For a man who built a career on crafting psychological terror, Alfred Hitchcock's own deepest fear was surprisingly ordinary: eggs. Ovophobia, an intense aversion to eggs, may seem trivial, but for Hitchcock, it was a horror greater than any of his films. He once described the sight of a runny yolk as more disturbing than blood, calling it revolting. This fear went beyond simple dislike. He refused to eat eggs in any form and would physically recoil at the sight of someone cracking one open. Some speculate that his aversion stemmed from childhood, though Hitchcock himself never explained its origins. What's undeniable is how it subtly influenced his work. Food in his films often carried an unsettling weight. Mealtime conversations in Psycho and The Birds are filled with tension, and the very act of eating becomes ominous. His phobia was so deeply ingrained that even in his personal life, he avoided kitchens where eggs were being prepared. For a man whose genius lay in turning the mundane into the macabre, his own fear was a reminder that horror isn't always found in the shadows. Sometimes it's sitting right on your breakfast plate. W.C. Fields, fear of children. W.C. Fields built a career playing the grumpy, cantankerous misanthrope, but his disdain for children wasn't just an act. It was rooted in genuine discomfort. His fear of children wasn't about disliking them. It was an unease so strong that he actively avoided young co-stars and refused roles that required interactions with them. Off-screen, he steered clear of family gatherings where children were present, and when he did encounter them, he was known to keep his distance, often with a sarcastic remark to mask his discomfort. Some believed this phobia stemmed from his own difficult childhood, while others speculated it was simply his reclusive nature amplified by the unpredictable chaos that children brought. Ironically, his fear became part of his comedic persona. His films often featured exaggerated versions of this phobia, with his characters finding increasingly absurd ways to evade troublesome kids. Whether it was real or just an extension of his larger-than-life character, his aversion became a defining quirk of both his public and private life. James Stewart, fear of public speaking. James Stewart was known for his everyman charm and warm, stammering delivery, but that signature hesitation wasn't just an acting choice. It stemmed from a lifelong fear of public speaking. Off-screen, he avoided speeches whenever possible, and when he had no choice, he meticulously prepared, rehearsing every word to avoid stumbling. Even casual interviews made him uneasy, and he was known to deflect attention away from himself with self-deprecating humor. Some believed his anxiety came from his naturally reserved personality, while others pointed to his early career struggles, where his soft-spoken nature often led to nerves under pressure. This fear extended beyond Hollywood. Even when serving in the military, he was reluctant to speak in front of large groups. Yet, somehow, this vulnerability made him all the more relatable. His hesitant, heartfelt delivery became one of his trademarks. While he conquered many challenges throughout his career, the fear of standing before an audience never truly left him. Mae West, fear of aging. For a woman who built an entire persona around confidence, sensuality, and wit, Mae West's greatest fear was the one thing even she couldn't outmaneuver: aging. She wasn't just wary of getting older. She actively fought against it with an obsession that shaped her career, her image, and even her daily life. She surrounded herself with younger men, meticulously controlled how she was photographed, and refused to acknowledge the passing years. Even as she entered her later decades, she continued to play characters as ageless as she wanted to be seen, insisting on heavy makeup, carefully styled wigs, and wardrobe choices that defied time. Some saw this as vanity, but for West, it was deeper than that. It was a refusal to let Hollywood, or the world, define her by numbers. She carefully curated her public image, never appearing frail or conceding to the idea that youth was fleeting. In the end, her fear didn't diminish her. It became part of her legend. She aged, but on her own terms, never letting the passage of time dull the bold, brash persona she had so carefully built. Errol Flynn, fear of drowning. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling hero of Hollywood's golden age, made a living playing fearless adventurers. But there was one thing that terrified him: water. Despite his on-screen image as a daring pirate and explorer, Flynn had an intense fear of drowning. He avoided swimming whenever possible and was visibly uneasy during film shoots that required him to be in the ocean. His discomfort with water extended beyond work. He rarely engaged in water sports, preferring to stay on solid ground. Some speculated that this fear stemmed from a childhood incident, while others believed it was simply an anxiety that grew over time. Ironically, he was often cast in roles that required him to appear fearless on the open seas, forcing him to endure his phobia for the sake of authenticity. During the filming of Captain Blood, crew members noted his nervous energy whenever water scenes were involved. Off-screen, he carefully planned vacations and traveled to avoid situations where he might be forced into deep water. For a man who made a career out of looking fearless, his fear of drowning was a hidden vulnerability, one he could never quite escape. Rita Hayworth, fear of crowds. Doesn't it look odd to say that a person in Hollywood, adored by millions, feared crowds and avoided public appearances? Well, that was Rita Hayworth. Beneath the dazzling smile and screen presence, she struggled with a deep anxiety about large gatherings. Award shows, premieres, and press events, things most stars thrived on, were sources of discomfort for her. While she could command a stage effortlessly, the moment she stepped off, she wanted nothing more than to disappear. Some believe this fear stemmed from the pressures of fame, while others point to her personal struggles, including her turbulent marriages and the constant scrutiny she faced. Even during interviews, she appeared guarded, her discomfort evident in the way she carried herself. Over time, her fear grew stronger, and she gradually withdrew from the limelight, choosing a quieter, more private life. Her legacy remains that of a Hollywood goddess, but behind the scenes, she was a woman who longed for solitude in a world that wouldn't stop watching. Marlene Dietrich, Fear of Fire. Marlene Dietrich exuded confidence, elegance, and an almost untouchable allure, but one thing truly unsettled her: fire. Unlike minor anxieties, her fear was so intense that it dictated aspects of her daily life. Candles, fireplaces, and even cigarette lighters made her visibly uneasy. On film sets, she was known to double-check fire safety precautions, refusing to work in environments where open flames were used carelessly. Some linked this fear to her early years in Germany, where wartime destruction left lasting scars on many. Others believe it was simply an instinctive phobia, exacerbated by Hollywood's reliance on stage lights, electrical setups, and flammable materials. Even in private, Dietrich went to great lengths to minimize fire risks, ensuring her home was as fireproof as possible. Ironically, she was often seen smoking on screen, the epitome of cool sophistication, yet behind the scenes, she avoided fire at all costs. The contrast between her on-screen boldness and her off-screen caution was a hidden layer of complexity in a woman already known for her many contradictions. Charlie Chaplin, Fear of Baldness. For a man who built an empire on visual comedy, Charlie Chaplin's greatest insecurity wasn't his appearance as the tramp. It was the thought of losing his hair. Chaplin had an overwhelming fear of baldness, one that bordered on obsession. He was meticulous about his hair, frequently checking for signs of thinning and going to great lengths to maintain his signature look. Some believe this fear was tied to his image. After all, his ability to transform into different characters often relied on his physicality, and losing his hair felt like losing control. He reportedly experimented with various remedies, from special hair treatments to unproven homeopathic solutions, all in the hopes of keeping his hair intact. On set, he was known to adjust lighting and camera angles to ensure his hairline looked as full as possible. While the world saw an actor who could make them laugh without saying a word, Chaplin himself was deeply conscious of his appearance. One stray hair could send him into a quiet panic. His fear never fully materialized, but it remained a nagging concern throughout his career, proving that even comedy legends have their own private anxieties. Gary Cooper, Fear of Guns. For a man whose career was built on playing rugged, gunslinging cowboys, Gary Cooper harbored an ironic and well-hidden fear. He was deeply uneasy around guns, while his on-screen persona exuded toughness. In real life, firearms made him uncomfortable. He handled them professionally for his roles, but behind the scenes, he avoided unnecessary interactions with them whenever possible. Some attribute this fear to an accident in his younger years, while others believe it was simply a natural aversion that clashed with Hollywood's demand for Western heroes. During filming, he relied on expert coaching to ensure his gun scenes looked authentic, but he was never at ease. Even when hunting, a common pastime among Hollywood elites of his era, he preferred to be an observer rather than a participant. His ability to mask his discomfort was remarkable. Audiences believed in his fearless lawmen and sharpshooters, never knowing that the very props that defined his career were the things he feared most. It was a contradiction he carried throughout his life, proving that not every Western legend felt at home with a gun in hand. Buster Keaton, Fear of Water. Buster Keaton, the silent film legend known for his fearless physical comedy, harbored a fear that seemed at odds with his daring on-screen persona. He was terrified of water. Unlike a mere discomfort, this phobia stemmed from a traumatic childhood incident when he nearly drowned. The experience left a lasting imprint, making him uneasy around large bodies of water for the rest of his life. Though he performed dangerous stunts that often involved falls, crashes, and near-death moments, he actively avoided water sequences whenever possible. When films required him to interact with water, he meticulously planned every movement to maintain control over the situation. Off-screen, he steered clear of lakes, rivers, and the ocean, rarely engaging in activities like swimming or boating. This fear stood in stark contrast to his on-screen image. a man who could survive any peril with a deadpan expression. But while the world saw a fearless daredevil, Keaton carried a quiet dread, proving that even the bravest entertainers had their own hidden vulnerabilities. Cary Grant, fear of lightning. Cary Grant, the epitome of charm and effortless cool, had one fear that could shake his composure: lightning. Unlike minor anxieties, this fear bordered on phobia. Storms made him visibly uneasy, and he often took extreme precautions whenever thunderclouds rolled in. Friends and colleagues recalled how he would retreat indoors at the first sign of a storm, sometimes closing curtains to block out flashes of lightning. Some believed this fear was linked to his childhood, while others speculated it was an irrational anxiety that developed over time. Even when traveling, he checked weather forecasts obsessively, adjusting plans to avoid turbulent skies. His reluctance to be caught outside during a storm occasionally disrupted filming schedules, though he rarely spoke openly about it. The irony of his fear was not lost on those who knew him. On screen, he exuded confidence in the most chaotic situations, but in real life, a single bolt of lightning could unravel the composure of Hollywood's smoothest leading man. Humphrey Bogart, fear of boats. For a man who became synonymous with classic noir and tough guy roles, Humphrey Bogart harbored an unexpected fear. He hated boats. Though he played seafaring characters in films like The African Queen, being on the water filled him with discomfort. Some speculated that his fear stemmed from early childhood experiences, while others believed it was a mix of motion sickness and unease about the unpredictability of open water. On set, he tolerated boats only when necessary, often relying on doubles for scenes that required extended time at sea. Even in his personal life, he avoided yachts and sailing excursions, preferring solid ground over the uncertainty of waves. This aversion didn't stop him from delivering convincing performances, but behind the tough exterior was a man who wanted nothing more than to stay far from the water's edge. It was an irony that Hollywood never saw: the hard-boiled detective and war hero who would rather take his chances in a dark alley than on a boat. Gloria Swanson, fear of being forgotten. For Gloria Swanson, the fear of being forgotten wasn't just a passing insecurity. It was an all-consuming dread that shaped her career and personal life. Unlike many silent film stars who faded into obscurity as talkies took over, Swanson refused to be left behind. She fought to remain relevant, carefully curating her image and choosing roles that kept her in the public eye. Even after Hollywood moved on, she worked tirelessly to maintain her place in the industry, engaging in radio, television, and public appearances to remind the world of her legacy. This fear also played into her personal life. She surrounded herself with admirers and made sure her influence never waned. Her most famous role in Sunset Boulevard was eerily reflective of her deepest anxiety, portraying a once glamorous star struggling with irrelevance. While audiences celebrated her comeback, Swanson saw it as a stark warning. She lived her life ensuring she would never be just a footnote in history. And in the end, she succeeded. Her name remains immortal, just as she always feared it wouldn't. Not just old celebrities, even new celebrities have weird phobias. Jennifer Aniston, fear of flying. Jennifer Aniston, beloved for her role on Friends and her subsequent film career, has long grappled with an intense fear of flying. Ironically, her job often requires frequent air travel for movie shoots and press tours, forcing her to confront this phobia head-on. She's described gripping her seat or seeking distraction during takeoff and turbulence, using conversation and humor as coping mechanisms. Some of her close friends have mentioned how her anxiety can escalate before big trips, making even the glamorous side of Hollywood life feel daunting. Despite her discomfort, Aniston continues to take to the skies because her career demands it, proving that her resilience in real life mirrors the sunny determination fans see on screen. Adele, stage fright. Though her voice has filled arenas worldwide, Adele suffers from stage fright so crippling it can bring her to tears before performances. Fans might find it surprising that someone with such a commanding presence can be so uneasy under the spotlight. Her fear is not just about hitting every note perfectly. It's about baring her soul before thousands of strangers and fearing their judgment. Stories abound of her pacing backstage, hands trembling, as she rehearses lines and vocal runs to steady her nerves. Yet once she steps onto the stage, her vulnerability transforms into raw power. Adele's battle with anxiety reminds us that even unparalleled talent comes with its own set of challenges. Taylor Swift, fear of sea urchins. Taylor Swift, known for her record-breaking albums and sold-out world tours, harbors an unusual fear: sea urchins. She's openly spoken about her phobia in interviews, describing the sharp-spined creatures as nightmares lurking beneath the ocean's surface. Ironically, Swift's image often includes breezy beach scenes and summer vibes, yet she admits to feeling uneasy the moment she steps into unfamiliar waters. The possibility of accidentally stepping on one of these spiky animals is enough to keep her ankles above the surf. While it may seem trivial compared to the demands of stardom, Swift's fear is a poignant reminder that no matter how poised or successful, celebrities can have very down-to-earth anxieties. Megan Fox, fear of dry paper. Megan Fox, often cast as a confident, tough heroine, has confessed to a peculiar fear of dry paper, such as unlaminated scripts or restaurant napkins. She has described the texture as unbearable, likening it to nails on a chalkboard. This aversion goes beyond mere preference. It genuinely unsettles her to the point where she's been known to carry a cup of water so she can wet her fingers before handling paper. While this phobia might sound minor, it illustrates how an everyday item can become a major source of discomfort. Despite the demands of memorizing lines and signing autographs, Fox navigates her world in a way that accommodates this deeply personal quirk.